We're starting right now, but yes, you can. Today is Tuesday, it's January 21st. Glad to see you all. I hope you had a nice weekend. It is 1:15-ish, and we are continuing our work on education finance. Learning about all the various tax expenditures from the education fund. Some of these we'll spend more time on in future. Some of these were, this might be enough background on it, but just really want us to understand. We talked about what is in the education fund, but this is an opportunity to sort of talk about what isn't in the education fund because of policy decisions. And so, any, I don't know, announcements anyone has? Nice Tuesday morning, pulled out. I think everyone already knows that. Okay, great. Are you kicking us off?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. Great. As the chair mentioned, I'll be talking about property tax expenditures in the education fund. I'll be talking about the list of expenditures that are in the tax expenditure report that was finally made it out into the world today. Thank you, appreciate it. So you all can have more than enough fun with that if you so desire, but I'll run through the property tax section of that and then pivot into tax increment financing, which is in the tax expenditure report, but can be complex and weedy program. So dive in and do a bit of a 101 on that piece. And my is going on here. The slides I just clicked on are completely blank, and they weren't when I first started.
We can see them, but you cannot.
No, they just moved to a blank. That's very strange. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe I will need a little time to figure out some tech.
That's great. Well, I'll be
Right back, get my hot water.
Fill your hot water.
So I still have them on my screen, if that's worth anything.
Thank you. I wish somehow they could move from your screen onto my screen. That would be lovely. Maybe I will go and just pull them up in PowerPoint, which isn't ideal, but that's good. Okay. Great. Okay, that should do it. Figured out the gremlins. So no, I've mentioned this in the chair before, but just some general overview on the tax expenditure report. Every 2 years, our office and the Department of Taxes are required to publish an inventory of the various tax expenditures in existence. To be clear, tax expenditures are provisions that reduce the amount of revenue that would be otherwise collected to encourage particular activities or limit the amount of taxes collected from certain persons. And tax expenditures have the same fiscal effect as direct appropriations. This is revenue that the state is not collecting. There are 4 items that are not considered tax expenditures. Revenue that's outside of taxing power, provisions outside the normal structure, something like current use is not in the tax expenditure report, revenue that is just too complicated to get at. And then finally, we We don't catalog, for example, the state making purchases that would be exempt from sales and use. It's not a part of the tax expenditure report.
Can you give an example of outside the taxing power of the state?
That is a good question. I pulled it from the tax expenditure report. Yes, but I will, yes, provide an example.
Maybe railway infrastructure?
Possible.
Okay, we'll find out.
Yes, stay tuned. On the property tax expenditure side, in fiscal year 26, they're estimated to reduce state revenues by $115.5 million. And this is compared to $94.3 million in actual value that was recorded in fiscal year 23. Large projected increases in property taxes, kind of in that time frame, with some property value growth is behind that increase. And primarily in this presentation, there's a long list of exemptions. We're going to focus on 4. They are by far the largest and comprise most of the value that is exempted on the property tax side. And those are the public, pious, and charitable property tax expenditure, which is estimated at $72.3 million. Exemptions for the University of Vermont and Vermont State College properties, which together represent 23 and change million dollars in fiscal year 26. And then finally, tax increment financing districts. I put the fiscal year 25 value in here because the consensus, we work with the Department of Taxes to develop a consensus estimate, and that will be presented at the e-board tomorrow. So it's not quite out there. And then, yes, as mentioned, current use or the full title of the use value appraisal program is not a part of the tax expenditure report.
Tim, what did you just say is not part of the total expenditure?
Report, and Ezra will come and he's part of our time here this afternoon, and he will give you a lot more detail and dollar figures and estimates for current use. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. The statutory purpose. So generally, when you have a tax expenditure, there's an associated statutory purpose for the public, pious, and charitable exemption. That statutory purpose is to allow organizations, churches, nonprofits, to dedicate more of their financial resources to their public service missions. The other key part of this is that these exemptions have been in effect for an extremely long time. The exemption in 38024, which includes broad swaths of public and pious property, have been around in some version for as long as Vermont's been a state.
Does this include when a nonprofit claims it has a municipal purpose, so it's exempt from Act 250 fees, for example? Is that included in your estimate of the total cost associated with this?
This would be explicitly on property taxes. Exemptions from Act 250 fees would be another
So this
piece.
understates the exemptions that we give to
Sure.
the private sector.
Yeah, this wouldn't include all of it, exactly.
And just to be clear, this means, for example, when a general store becomes a nonprofit as opposed to a business, we are adding them to the exempt tax base.
I would defer to legislative counsel. I know from my previous life that it's not always for a nonprofit, a 501c3. It has to be voted on by the town, and then I have to meet certain there's like a means test that goes along with that. But I would defer to Kirby to explain that exemption in more detail.
I didn't understand that. So every nonprofit has to be approved by the town before it's eligible.
Let's have Kirby in, because
Okay.
I know there's nuance between some categories don't have to be approved by the town and some do. And then
Yes.
some, if they're approved by the town, get their state taxes covered and some don't. And there's like a whole wild system that we have slowly created of it. And so we'll have Kirby in for that. I also, a expenditure to the education fund that is not an expenditure on property taxes for nonprofits. It's also like all the, we talked about that in the context of sales tax too. So that's also like ed fund expenditure for nonprofits.
Exactly. And as we just talked about, there are certain tax exemptions that require a townwide vote. So yes, your fraternal organizations, volunteer fire rescue organizations, those require a townwide vote. Orphanages, homes, hospitals. And yes, when property is used for health or recreational purposes. So there are certain ones that are outlined to require a townwide vote. Moving on to higher education. The statutory purpose is very similar to the one previous. This is allowing the purpose of this expenditure or exemption is to provide higher education institutions the ability to deploy more of their financial resources to their educational mission. Similarly, these have been on the books for a long time. The University of Vermont exemption was enacted in 1802. A note about how higher education institutions are treated for the purposes of the pilot program, the payment in lieu of taxation program, which is funded through a portion of local option tax receipts. Municipalities are reimbursed at 100% of the taxable insurance value of state college buildings. However, there's a statutory cap on University of Vermont properties, which is $750,000. And that amount has been in place since the beginning of the pilot program. So the 4 property tax exemptions that I shared at the beginning of the slide, so public, pious, and charitable, the 2 higher education exemptions and tax increment financing represent almost 89% of the estimated value of property tax expenditures as presented in the tax expenditure report. Remaining expenditures are a whole miscellaneous collection of other uses, cemeteries, libraries, personal property that's involved in snowmaking equipment.
Wait, just spend like a millisecond more on that.
On
Snowmaking.
snowmaking equipment. I know people have a lot of interest in it. I know snowmaking equipment. So yes, if you have like I don't even know, it's like a lift or something that would be exempt. If it was on the personal property tax roll, it would be exempted from property tax.
Do you have a sense of what is that expenditure? Is that like less than $1 million?
Oh yeah, so each I have the full table here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, exactly. It is projected in fiscal year 26 to be 3.4. It's the next biggest after those 4, $3.475 million. And it's increased slightly from 22 and 23. So yes, general table presented here as noted are big exemptions. And then yes, many of them are relatively small compared to those exemptions, but also includes things like YMCA and YWCAs. You have yes, qualified housing. So certain housing projects receive an exemption. There we are. And that table is in the tax expenditure report. So if you would like to spend more time with it, you're more than welcome to there. Moving on to tax increment financing districts. Okay. So before we begin and get into the nuts and bolts on tax increment financing, here are some key terms that you might hear me reference and wanted to put those up front. The taxable value is assessed value that is subject to state, municipal, or other taxes. The original taxable value is the base amount of property before establishment of the district. So that's what was in existence before a TIF. You'll hear me use the word increment amount, which is the difference between the current value and where it was set originally. And yes, there are related costs, which are costs that are not the actual construction of infrastructure. They may include consultants, necessary folks who are involved in the project to move it forward. And then the retention period is this is the amount of time that a municipality is entitled to capture tax increments to finance their infrastructure improvements. So those are a lot of terms. A TIF kind of follows these 4 steps, and they're used by municipalities and states to finance economic development by diverting a portion of the growth in future property tax revenues within a specific area to pay for specific improvements that have been identified as necessary to the TIF district's kind of success. So step 1, a municipality is interested in improving a geographic area. This could be somewhere downtown, this could be lighted land, this could be a brownfield, and they are investing in new infrastructure. So this could be streetscaping. In Barrie, there's some streetscaping work that was done downtown to improve connections between Main Street and some parking areas. The municipality finances these infrastructures with improvements with borrowed funds. So they go out and bond. The improvements stimulate private development in an area because of the streetscaping, because of the infrastructure, maybe water, sewer. Increased development may be able to happen in that area. And then the municipality pays back the borrowed sum of that bonding. They pay for the debt service using a portion of the increased tax revenues that result from those improvements. In Vermont, that split is currently 70% to TIF district debt, 30% to the education fund. And in the VEPC 2024 TIF report, they have this great graph that shows the mechanics of a TIF program. And it also includes key features about kind of some of the key features about the timeline in TIF district creation and retention periods. And so, yeah, you can see the original taxable value, the base value of all the property in the district, and then show as property values increase above that original taxable value, a portion goes to development, a portion goes to the education fund, that 30% in light blue. And then when the retention period ends after 20 years, the total taxable value, including the base and the incremental property growth, goes to the education fund.
And all of this has become very contentious at various sort of spark points over the years. Encourage people to read both the TIF reports from VEPC and the TIF reports from JFO and TIF reports from the auditor's office. Many choices to dig in on this. And the Commerce Committee, I think, is planning on taking some testimony on TIFs as well this session.
Sources sending us all those reports, those you just.
She can, yeah.
I'm also more than happy to collect
Thank you.
essential reading on TIFs.
That would be
for you
delightful.
all. Yes. Mhm.
My understanding from reading some work by the Lincoln Land Institute is one of the concerns about TIF in Vermont is that TIF works when the value of the development goes to the overlying authority. And that one of the concerns here has been that the benefit may not go back to the ed fund as much as it does to local. For example, if you're taking private parking lots and making them municipal parking lots, you're actually reducing the total value to the overlying authority by pulling some land off the tax base. Or if you're redistributing business within Vermont, moving businesses into urban areas and out of more rural communities, you're not actually increasing total revenue to the ed fund, you're just moving it to a different community. Is that something that's come up in the context of TIF discussions in Vermont?
I'm glad you brought that up. We're going to go into a whole discussion about the counterfactual kind of but for conditions that exist within TIF districts. There absolutely is research that some of it indicates that TIFs do pull development from surrounding areas, which in Vermont is a concern for the education fund. So yes, absolutely, we will go into that more in detail.
Yeah, can you explain why it's a concern for the education fund?
I will go into that.
We get to
Yes,
that.
yes, I will absolutely get to that. So the next few slides will be a bit of an FAQ. around kind of major questions for the education fund, and just TIF districts in general. So how much tax increment can a municipality retain? It all depends on when they were created. So there's been a long legislative history with TIFs. Depending on when the TIF was created, they were allowed to keep certain percentages of incremental value. The current statute says that 85% of the municipal tax increment goes to TIF district debt, and that no more than 70% of the statewide education tax increment goes to TIF district debt. Certainly older districts can retain more than 70%. Most states retain, or TIF districts retain 75%, because they were created in the period when that was the statutory structure. The next question is, how can TIF money be used? This is largely on infrastructure improvements. There is a definition of what counts as an improvement. And this focuses on the installation, construction, or reconstruction of infrastructure that will serve a public purpose. And so this includes things like utilities, transportation, public facilities, land and property acquisition and demolition, and site preparation. It also means funding of some interest payments while a TIF district is starting up to help make the initial financing more viable. And unlike in other states, TIF money cannot be used to subsidize private developer costs. How long can TIF or towns retain debt and incur debt and retain increment? So the incursion period, so this is how long municipalities or districts are able to ask their voters to bond for new debt for infrastructure improvements. So they're only allowed to do that for 5 years after creation of the district. They can go and ask for a 5-year extension. There were various legislative actions during COVID-19 to extend those incursion periods. During COVID, understandably, very hard to plan, to get projects in line. And so the legislature decided to give towns more time to bond for improvements in the district. On the debt retention side, in statute, the retention period is 20 years from when a district first incurs debt. The first incursion of debt essentially starts the clock, and the district has 20 years to retain education property tax revenue. They can, after that 20 years, the municipality can certainly use increment or a portion on their side to fund district debt. And the Burlington waterfront can retain it longer. Also, Hartford and Barry recently asked for an extension to their TIF increment retention periods.
Yeah. On this one, do those numbers include the new TIF just approved in Killington, or the new expansion for wastewater in Killington?
These numbers for incursion and retention?
Yeah,
Yes.
so that is the current TIF that was implemented last year. So it
Yes.
says 22 was created, so it's just an addition to an existing TIF.
So yes, in 22 is, yes, sufficient.
And it was expanded in 24.
They may have, yes. I don't know if they filed a substantial change request, but it was created in 22 to fund those infrastructure, water and sewer improvements up the access road. Geographically, where are Vermont's TIF districts? 4 out of 9 of the existing TIF districts are in Chittenden County. All TIF districts are, except for Killington, are municipalities with a population greater than 10,000 people. Any new TIF district that's created has to meet 2 of the 3 location criteria. So they have to be in a high density area, some sort of designated downtown, or an economically distressed area, which is defined in statute. No new TIF districts can be created in a town that already has one. And only 6 TIF districts can be created beyond the ones that are listed in statute.
St. Albans is technically the city though. which has about 7,500 or 8,000 residents.
I will check. I thought I Googled everyone to check the population on that one. But I will, if I'm incorrect, I will certainly, yes.
Same with Berry City too, we're only around 8,500.
One of the, I think one of the things we might get into later is that can you go back one slide?
Yes.
The criteria have been interpreted differently at different times throughout the life of TIFs.
So recent TIF legislation. So the last major piece of TIF legislation was in 2017 with Act 69. It set the current increment retention percentages, so the 85% for municipalities, 70% for the statewide education property tax. Before Act 69, new districts only had to meet one of the location criteria I showed in the previous slide, and it did implement that cap on the number of districts. Since 2017, there have been numerous extensions of debt periods, and also Act 72 of 2023 extended the retention periods of Barry and Hartford.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
How long what's the duration of the debt typically on a municipal project, like water, or sewer, that kind of thing? Is that like a 20-year bond or 30 years? I was just wondering, because you were saying that the retention period is 20 years from when a municipality starts incurring debt. So you could envision a bond that's 20 or 30 years that's done in, year 3. What happens after the retention period is over? If that's set at 20 years, how does the municipality then pay for the remainder of the debt service?
So many in TIF district financing plans, many of the bonding that they're undertaking is shorter than 20 years, just so they have the increment to be able to pay for it. There are cases when they go to bond or file a substantial change request where the debt service is estimated to run past the 20-year retention period, in which case the municipality is paying for the debt service. It's often the case that the payments on debt service aren't necessarily, they're not the same amount throughout the full year of bonding. And so you might have the bond payments or a lot of the interest front loaded so that the bond payments at the end of the instrument, right, are much less. So it's easier for the municipality to cover those payments. Moving on to fiscal impacts. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the counterfactual and but for. And when you hear people talking about but for and saying the words but for, it's pulling from in 32 VSA 5404. When BEPC is reviewing TIF district applications, there's this piece A that requires them to determine the infrastructure improvements that would be involved, Gesundheit, to serve the TIF district, and that the associated development in the district would not have occurred as proposed or would have occurred in a different and less desirable manner, but for the proposed utilization of incremental tax revenues. And so we're trying to figure out in that but for what would have happened with or without a TIF district. And so if you believe, or if it is true that 100% of district development would not have occurred elsewhere in the state without TIFs, then that is a positive benefit to the education fund, right? There wouldn't have been those addition of new projects, so there wouldn't have been additional revenue accruing to the education fund. However, if all of that development would have happened anyway, the incremental revenues that happen you're losing 70% of those to TIF district debt and only receiving 30%. So this counterfactual question is hugely important when looking at fiscal impacts. And so to run kind of through specific examples of different projects and how that might impact these considerations, right? There's, as we'll talk about, it's rarely the case that something's 100% or 0% true, particularly in looking at a counterfactual question like this. So in the example of a housing developer who's looking to build a project in Chittenden County, if they build in Winooski, that project 100% benefits the education fund. And holding this example, we're assuming that this development is going to occur in exactly the same way in these two different locations. So if you're building in, however, if you build in South Burlington, only 25% of the kind of value of that development in property tax revenues accrue to the education fund. And so that 75% represents foregone revenue that the state's not collecting. However, a manufacturer who's interested in building a new facility in New England, if they decide to locate that in the Hartford TIF district, there's a 25% benefit to the education fund, but that would be lost if they build in New Hampshire. And there are many examples between these two kind of pro forma examples. It might be true that by providing infrastructure in a given area, a TIF would allow a project to move forward more quickly than it would have. A TIF may change the scope of projects. So there might be able to be a larger apartment complex may go from X number of units to Y because there's increased infrastructure. And those all have very nuanced effects on kind of looking at the fiscal impacts of usage of TIFs. And there are three kind of models or three different ways of looking at this. Because unfortunately, it's truly impossible without some really rigorous statistical analysis that would be challenging to do in Vermont with our small number of TIF districts. It's impossible to know the true impact of TIF districts. So there are three different perspectives on looking at fiscal impacts. So one of them is there are figures in the VEPC annual report. And so they show that in 2021, for example, $1.2 million of incremental tax revenue went to the education fund. In 2023, that number was $1.7 million. And that's go back to the last slide. Those numbers would be a reflection of the fiscal impact of TIFs. If it was 100% true that the development would not have occurred elsewhere in the state, right? You're benefiting from the additional increment that goes to the education fund. That's a benefit because otherwise none of that development would have happened.
Yeah, Representative Woody.
Right, on the slide before it. Yeah. How much is lost to the education fund, but eventually all the additional revenue goes to the education.
Yes, after the end of the retention period. Yes.
Do you think you should put that on there?
It is in the graph that we showed with VEPC. And it is in the next model that we're going to go through in the JFO analysis. We do, when we're doing our modeling, once TIF districts end, we do account for what they added, what we forecast they may add to the education fund against kind of these counterfactual growth rates. So yes. So the second perspective is modeling that JFO created in response to the TIF report our office completes every 4 years. And so to add, the model attempts to answer the question, if parcels in the TIF district continue to grow as they did pre-TIF, how much would have been generated? And then comparing that counterfactual growth rate, which is the no TIF district comes into effect against what actually happens. What is the cost or benefit from that comparison? These numbers are from the previous TIF report. They will certainly be updated. Would like to share that from the modeling been completed, the numbers will look quite similar to this. And this shows, I'm using the word cost, but it's really foregone revenue to the education fund of between 5.5 and 7.5 million per year between 2023 and 2028, and slightly lower numbers between 2029 and 2034 going out in the future. And then finally, tomorrow at the emergency board, JFO and tax produces a consensus estimate of $7.14 million. And this is on this model to forecast kind of the maximum potential cost of TIF programs, uses the 0% true. So saying that all development would have occurred elsewhere in the state.
Representative Woody.
Well, I think it just would be better if you wrote foregone revenue, cost,
Yes.
because that's what it actually is.
So Representative Woody, this is a fairly contentious issue, right? And so I think that JFO is doing their best to present multiple perspectives on it and has been navigating the politics of that for a while now. And so let's just not edit the slides in real time and let them do their job.
Said it's foregone revenue. It'd be terrible if everybody is thinking it's cost.
Well,
I think.
I don't
The same thing.
I don't know what the difference is between cost and foregone revenue.
Yes, and that is true. And so, right, like going back to the beginning of the presentation where we're talking about tax expenditures representing the same piece as, or essentially acting as an appropriation. And so in that context, foregone revenue and costs have kind of similar impacts.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I just would like to say that, Ted, I know this is a very, very difficult topic. And JFO for years here, decades even, has been caught in the middle of this thing, trying to prepare and then present a fair description of what this program is, what it does, and then Betsy takes it and tries to use all that bit of information, all those bits of information to either justify granting a TIF or not. And so I think you're doing a really good job of describing what happens. This is not something we can learn in one afternoon. I mean, I've been on Ways and Means where we've spent half the time, literally a year, talking about TIF districts and coming up with the changes. And the TIF district report, that originated with the committee, the Ways and Means Committee, going through page by page, trying to evaluate the cost and the loss to the ed fund of each one of these projects. I mean, it's phenomenal. And then the almost last thing I'm gonna say is I think I'm on page 20. I've never seen written in before anywhere that impossible to know the true impact of TIF districts across these different dimensions. I know former members of this committee who would have had a fit over that statement. So you're brave. Very, very pleased to see that. Not that, I mean, I can think of a lot of things wrong with TIF districts and why we shouldn't be doing them, but when it comes down to it, what else have we got for economic development for the state of Vermont? Not much. And so unless we can think of a different way to get the money other than the ed fund, I think we're stuck there.
And so we are not going to spend the whole session talking about TIF,
Aw.
but we are asking every committee in the House at least to be taking on sort of their piece of the education fund. And so my understanding is the Commerce Committee is going to spend some time on TIF, and if they send us something, we will spend time with it. But they will do the initial wrestling, not
TIFs, they are. And what's the question they have to
I
investigate?
don't know yet.
There we go.
Well, we'll figure it out.
Can we give them questions?
Sure. I mean, they don't have to take those questions, but you can give them questions, absolutely, yes.
Because, if we could think of another source of money, then the taxpayers who pay property taxes that go for school would be much better off. I don't know where else we could get the money, but if we stop taking it out of the ed fund, then all those property taxpayers are gonna be better off.
Maybe.
Because the cost.
I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think everyone would, like, I wouldn't know it. I don't know if Representative Kimball agrees with you.
I know.
Okay, but we're not gonna debate tips right now. We're gonna finish the presentation.
It's great.
It is great. I joined Betsy for 6 whole months because I thought it was gonna be so fun.
You were on the Betsy committee?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It was just last by any. Back to you.
I was on for 3 years.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, as
Shut up.
there is, right, a lot of wrestling with impact of TIFs, understanding and my main goal here is to really present these different perspectives to help you all have context as you're seeing different numbers about the fiscal impacts of TIFs, and be able to think through how these different models fit within the ecosystem and help us better understand what magnitude of fiscal impacts we're seeing.
I'm telling you.
So the VEPSI annual report includes a whole host of district statistics, and I will share that with Sorsha, so she's able to forward to you all. And this shows $1.4 million in increment that were allocated to the education fund in fiscal year 23. I'd like to caution that using the statistics as the impact of the TIF program requires assuming that grand list growth is flat in before creation of the TIF. Because there is no background incremental growth that would be captured and kind of put into the TIF district. As shown in this VEPSI kind of charting here. However, all active TIF districts were growing in the years before TIF districts were created. And an additional piece is that grand list growth currently is quite high. An estimate or an actual 9.7% in fiscal year 24.
Can you help us understand the history to that choice of methodology? Because that seems that you're inevitably going to discover an effect.
So I think these statistics are helpful to understand how much incremental revenues are being put from TIF districts into the education fund. And so as summary informative statistics are helpful in that context, I think they're more challenging in thinking about them as impact figures, if that helps.
But this says fiscal impact. So why wouldn't you use a difference in differences or something like that to look at the impact of a TIF as opposed to no TIF?
Yeah, ideally, if you were able to do that type of statistical analysis, that is certainly above my pay grade. Just wanted to show these numbers and how they exist in the VEPSI annual report. But yes, if you were looking for fiscal impacts, more rigorous analysis, as you said, in a difference in difference, may be a better way to get at that. The JFO model, as mentioned, attempts to add that piece of counterfactual or background growth rates into the picture to add a little more nuance and get potentially a clearer picture of the fiscal impacts of tax increment financing districts. And so showing in this figure to the right, so if you have property value growth that is positive, it's likely to assume that property tax or that property growth or at least using it as a counterfactual to show what might happen in absence of a TIF district. And if the amount of property tax revenue that would occur without a TIF district is greater than the 30% of increment they're receiving, or 25%, depending on the TIF district. If that is greater, then there's a estimate of foregone revenue to the education fund. So JFO looked at a different periods of time, but the long-term growth rates in different TIF districts before the creation of the TIF. For a TIF district to fall in this category where they create foregone revenue, it's more likely that a TIF district will fall in this category if they have high original taxable values. So if they were a large district at creation, the percentage increase year over year in that taxable value means that it's harder for incremental revenues to beat that counterfactual. And if you have a high background growth rate, right? If you're growing at 5% every year, you have large incremental, or you have large counterfactual growth that again is challenging for there to be enough development to overcome. And so districts there creating likely some foregone revenue for the education fund.
Could I just ask a question on looking at the background growth for the TIF district itself? Are you able just to separate the grand list value of the parcels within the TIF district, or are you taking the whole municipality?
In nearly all cases where we were able to do that, Killington, for example, there was a lot of movement in parcels and how they're created and separated. So in Killington, I know also in Milton, it was hard to understand what was happening specifically in the TIF district. But for the others, we were, and by we, I mean Graham Campbell, who was here before me, was able to do that analysis and look specifically at what was occurring in the TIF district.
TIF district.
Mm-hmm. On the other side, in this model, TIF districts can generate additional revenue to the education fund if the amount of the 30% increment that's generated is above the property value growth that would have occurred without TIF. And so that may occur in districts with low original taxable values, so smaller districts at creation. So an example might be Killington, if they're able to generate increment at the rate that they've shown in their original kind of application.
Yeah, just make one,
Of course.
snarky comment.
Did you say one snarky or one unsnarky?
Snarky.
No.
One doesn't do smart.
I just want to say that if it wasn't for the way the ed fund is designed, whether this invention makes money or not, the ed fund can make up, because the ed fund can generate its own income. We just set the tax rate different. So if we gobble up all the revenue that otherwise, I'm not gonna look at it. We're, so, gobble up all the revenue this thing could have generated and throw it into a TIF district, or 3 like Milton had, then that's what happens to your ed fund money. And the poor guy, you know, throwing hay onto the wagon and selling it to pay his property tax never knows what's happening to that property tax money that he wrote the check for in October.
I don't think that's snarky. I think that's a very good policy point, Representative.
I don't want to make Ted feel bad, 'cause none of this is.
No, you can, no, that's not. We are just having a policy conversation now, but we're gonna, Representative Odie, and then we're gonna go back to the presentation.
Yeah, I went to an all-day seminar about tips. And
Was it in October?
yeah,
It was in Ireland. I meant to go to that.
and one question was, can you use other than the ed fund to help defray the cost of the tip? And the answer was, well, yes, in some states, there's the sales and use tax. So we have 100% of the sales and use tax goes into the ed fund in our state. So you can say that it's using the sales and use tax if you want to. It's all a construct. It's
Excellent.
whatever you
Yeah.
are happening to put in your education fund, so.
You're right, but you gotta get those figures to match.
So this is all about, that fund will, no, that's this much of what really we're using.
Or, you know,
That's the point.
we can learn more about how TIFs in other states are really just focused on their municipal tax and so don't have a statewide impact, but we're gonna, last one, and then
Use does.
I'd love us to hear most of the presentation and then have a policy conversation after, but yes.
But it
that's
is,
kind of full
but it is a political decision, because when it's buried in the ed fund, what we say is school taxes are too high. Montana, for example, pays for current use out of a separate wilderness tax, not out of the ed fund. And if we had a wilderness tax and did that, then our ed fund would have been 6.5 cents lower last year.
That,
Okay.
that makes sense.
We're gonna talk about current use after this.
Wilderness.
Such a fun day.
Not just kids we're talking about taking on, it's car use too.
That's right. That's for next up. We're on expenditure day.
I didn't even mention fire engines in the. Because that was in the tip too.
So we went through figures that were in the VEPSI annual report, talked a little bit about the JFO model, which is another perspective on the fiscal impacts of TIF districts. And then finally, JFO and the Department of Taxes were required to provide a consensus estimate of the maximum potential cost of TIF districts. So we're looking at worst case scenario, all of the development in the state would have happened, even though there is a TIF district. And so when you hold that assumption, all of the revenue that goes to pay for TIF district debt is foregone revenue for the education fund. And so we will present that estimate to the emergency board for fiscal year 26 tomorrow. I will note that so the JFO model and this consensus estimate is higher than the JFO model. And so the JFO model is somewhere in between, but maybe leans a little more in this direction in terms of magnitude. And again, since we're operating at one of the extremes, it's hard to hold this assumption that 100% of the time. So Killington's water system has been in the works since the 80s. South Burlington City Center, I know that has been visioned for a long time. And so it is possible that the TIF district helped catalyze all of these investments.
Sorry, I'm late. Maybe you've already explained this, but when you talk about the property tax grand list growth, is that based on actual growth and not like, let's say, a reappraisal that comes in with a property tax increase or a grand list increase?
So it would operate in the same way. So we're provided information from the tax department and then the actual values, so including reappraisals, the kind of modeling then gets multiplied by effective tax rates, which are adjusted by the CLA. So it incorporates that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
And so to summarize these different ways of looking at the counterfactual, different ways of looking at it provides different answers on the success or some of the fiscal impacts of the TIF program. Under the JFO model, and this lines up with some of the research that indicates that TIFs increase property values within a district, is that they generally represent foregone revenue to the education fund while active, but are a benefit when the district is retired compared to the counterfactual growth rates that were occurring before the TIF district was created. So they catalyze a little extra growth, but may not be enough to overcome the contribution of revenues to district debt. And then finally, the consensus estimate is considered the official estimate of the tax expenditure as it represents the most conservative estimate of the fiscal impact of TIFs. And so when I was looking at this, motivated two questions. One, how do TIFs interact with high rates of grand list growth? And then thinking about different ways of looking at the main value of TIFs, which y'all have already had a discussion around the table about. First, talking about our current structure. So before the pandemic, grand list growth rates were certainly not as high as they are now. There's substantial growth that's occurring overall in Vermont. Actual value of 9.7% grand list growth in fiscal year 24, and then projected values of 14% in fiscal year 25 and 26. These high rates of growth, talking about the JFO model, where we were talking about the districts that are more likely to create foregone revenue, one of the risks was high rates of background growth. So if a district is naturally growing at 9.7, 14%, that value is going to get captured by the TIF district and will not go to the education fund in the split, right? And so, yes, so it's much more likely in this current period that a new district created has a higher risk to the education fund. The second piece is thinking about the main value of the TIF program. Previous JFO reports have flagged, and I was able to find research published this year, that literature reviews that look at all of the available research in TIFs, many of which were done in Midwestern states that have a large number of TIF districts. It's easier to get like a difference in difference or a very rigorous statistical analysis of the impact of TIFs. Those literature reviews find that TIFs have not accomplished, or the evidence is weaker to support that TIFs promote economic development. So Merriman, this study published in 2018, is from the Lincoln Land Institute. And a quotation that was in the conclusion of that report says that rigorous evaluation suggests that in most cases, TIF has not accomplished the goal of promoting economic development. This more recent research, which looked at economic and fiscal impacts, similarly says that the economic and fiscal effects of TIF is mixed. And in the research, they really highlighted that there are a number of studies that found that TIF increased property values, but kind of these secondary impacts of job creation or economic activity were a little more elusive. And economic activity is measured by sales tax revenue. And, you know, a lot of interest, and even here, whether TIFs work on these economic development fronts. I do want to flag that the TIFs could have value in their ability to do infrastructure in development or support Vermont's land use goals.
I think there's an interesting thing about TIFs that we don't talk about, which is because because of all of the regulatory work we've done on them and our concerns related to them, there's an enormous amount of municipal attention and planning that has to go into one. And we very rarely have that level of municipal emphasis and planning in anything else. And it's possible that some of the benefit from that attention and not actually from the financial instrument.
Exactly, yes. So this is from some slides I presented last year. There's a JFO report about the challenges of funding municipal infrastructure. And I think we've all certainly heard discussion about the challenges of putting in infrastructure, particularly in smaller towns. There are a lot of capacity constraints. Would flag that TIFs, because of their work in planning and then, you know, going out to bond and reporting data and doing financial modeling, they're not accessible generally to larger municipalities. And also there's a challenge in terms of resources. So TIFs are able, I presented a capital stack for, or the capital stack for the Killington Water and Sewer Improvement Program. TIFs are able through bonding to provide a lot of resources to a municipality to complete infrastructure that's important to them and likely wouldn't have been possible without, or wouldn't have been possible by going to voters and asking for a bond that wasn't TIF funded.
It's about a sentence you said, about a slide back, you said economic activity is measured by sales tax revenue. So I'm thinking about housing on a brownfield, maybe 12 units of housing on a former brownfield. How much sales tax revenue could possibly be generated?
Right. So I was using sales tax revenue as an example of the outcomes the research was looking at.
So they don't only sales tax revenue?
No, there were various, yes, that was just an example.
Oh, oh.
Yep.
Okay. It's not hard. I was worried about that.
I like the way you're thinking.
It's good. And then the second piece, in addition to helping complete infrastructure and provide resources for various projects and municipalities, I did want to share the kind of close-knit relationship between statewide development goals that are in 24 VSA. There's a black box over the number 4302. And so those specific goals include maintaining the historic settlement pattern of compact villages and rural countryside. And also there are goals of encouraging growth in designated growth areas. And making investments in infrastructure that serve the compact development in those designated areas. And we've talked about the location criteria, but put them here again. But two of the location criteria are that the development is compact and high density, and it's in a designated area. And so TIFs, statewide development goals, closely linked. And I put in this next slide, the city of Burlington has done work to show where their TIF districts, so this is in the dotted yellow lines, fit within the new town center designation, which is in the orange dashed lines, and in a neighborhood development area. So to the chair's point of where the TIF district is planned for the city center, which is in those designated areas. And TIF could be a piece of the puzzle. The question is whether these benefits in infrastructure development and alignment, are they worth the resulting foregone tax revenue? And that's the question I'd leave you all with. Happy to answer questions.
So as we talk about economic development, one of the things that hasn't been in this presentation, I don't think JFO has ever done it, is looked at the additional sales and tax revenue or meals and rooms tax, because that does feed into the ed fund. So the question is, have you looked at that? So take the St. Albans TIF, for instance, how much revenue has been generated for that within that district above what was there before?
Exactly. So we don't do that type of more dynamic modeling and looking at kind of later economic development out to the to do so, you would have to hold some assumptions, and it's rigorous, and you look at a REMI model, right? And so it's just not modeling our office typically does. So to answer your question, no.
But it would
Not
be
able to.
fairly simple to look at the historical information about sales and tax revenue and meals and rooms revenue coming from that particular area.
Good. The question would be kind of counterfactual questions, and yeah, I think it would get quite complicated. Would defer to the experts.
Representative Woody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you ever ask the people who are doing the development, would you develop this without the TIF?
I think they would generally say yes. But yes, it is part of, so one of the.
This is, wait.
Yes.
Let's let Ted talk, because this is actually a really important part of the TIF.
Yes, it is part of the but for, and as I shared on a previous slide, let's see if I can find it. As part of the application process, VEPC is required to review, and they add commentary in their application on whether the proposed development would not have occurred as proposed in the application or would have occurred in a significantly different or less desirable manner. So when you look at TIF district applications, they'll say, for example, because the Killington water system, I use Killington as an example a lot because it's most recent. So in their application, since the water system is not likely to, in the application, not likely to have occurred without the TIF, that unlocks development in the new lodge they're building in Killington. And so that also can't really occur without the water system. And so that's commented on in the application. So it's part of the narrative and application process of developing a TIF, whether the development would have happened or not.
I guess then that comes into whether it's going to be in a desirable manner in terms of conform with the goals of Act 250.
Yes, and exactly. Compact development. South Burlington's TIF application mentions that, they were a suburban neighborhood without a TIF. It's likely that maybe the development, or it's possible that the development would have continued to stay more suburban in nature, which would have been against the statewide development goals.
With
Yes.
suburban eventually, but it's on farm. What's farm?
Yes, so they do comment on, yes, that less desirable manner is maybe compactness, for example.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Well, just one more. So St. Albans, if you take that one. So there was a proposal to develop more hotel rooms out by the interstate. So the TIF district was successful in convincing the developer to go into downtown St. Albans. So that's helped contribute to their revitalization. So the development would have occurred somewhere else, but the TIF district helped it where the city wanted it, to your point about land use, right? So that was, I think, a good example of it would have occurred somewhere else, but not necessarily where there was desire.
Yes, from what I've heard about that development, that's certainly an example.
And tomorrow morning, first thing, Kirby's going to come in and join us, and he can talk through any of the legal questions we have outstanding from this presentation. Because I think there were a few early on, but I'm sure we'll have more once he's sitting in front of us.
Are these the only 2 days we're gonna talk about tips?
That's not clear yet. And if folks want to spend a lot more time on it, we can talk about that too. But it's helpful to have the Commerce Committee start those conversations.
Yes.
And I imagine that there's going to be a new proposal for a new thing that's like TIF, but slightly different and prettier and better in all ways that will come here, and we will probably discuss that too. Maybe it'll be called DIF. I don't know. Okay, let us jump into current use with Ezra. Thank you very much, Ted.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're excited about the extra reading you're going to send us.
Oh, great.
Yes, and if you wanted to throw in a Lincoln Land Institute article, that's always appreciated too. Thanks.
Sorsha, do you know what the room key is?
Oh, and you've got to log into the Zoom to share your screen.
Okay. I don't think I have a Zoom link here. Thanks.
We have differences of opinion. This will be fun.
Yeah, that would be an understatement.
In some ways, I feel like we're starting with the easy stuff with this, which is like not. What does that mean for the rest of the session?
Like the fact it's bipartisan. It's you.
Hi, Carol.
It's fun. It's really kidding. He's like, you're
Snarky, yeah. Try not to be
I think it's.
You weren't being
You
snarky.
weren't snarky. That's not.
I was gonna say, like, that's your level of snark.
You can use a level for all conversations.
She's pretty gentle in her snarky.
I was gonna say, I'm just rude to them, if that's.
Chap Smith was in here and Michael Wachowski and Bud Otterman. You guys probably don't know any of those people.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we know
Yeah,
that.
why?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Bill Winters.
Yeah, Bill Winters. You didn't want to put a TIF on anything like, what do you call it, prime ag soil? Anything like prime ag soil, then that was bad. Which is where that hotel up by the exit 19 and 19.
Yeah.
That was prime ag soil.
Yeah.
So they put a gas station there.
Yeah.
That's a bummer.
Ezra,
alrighty, my apologies for the technical delay.
we actually love technical difficulties.
Okay, well, I
Gives us a
feel
few
better
minutes.
then. You're welcome. All right, so as y'all might remember, Ezra Holman joined fiscal office, and I'm here to talk with you about current use today. So yeah, let's just get started. So today we are just going to try and keep it very high level. I think Julia mentioned that you will have someone else later this week or perhaps next week coming in and giving you another overview on
Yes.
So we are going to hear from tax as part of the annual PPR report. We are going to go way deeper into current use with them and the whatever that committee next door is called, ag, food and something, markets. Is that what it's called? Agriculture, food and markets? No, that's not what it's called.
Food diversity.
Okay, whatever. Anyway, I'm getting way out of it. I'm so sorry. Okay, many apologies to the committee next door for not knowing the name of them. They are doing a deep dive into current use
Yeah, just
next week. Yes.
just bringing that up so that we can frame this as more of an education fund focus, not maybe all the other parts that go into current use. So just want to start off right now with that.
Thank you. And we will have an attorney join us tomorrow morning, so you're not responsible for those pieces either.
Super.
Yes.
Alrighty, so the current use overview. So current use, it is a incentive for the preservation, or at least that appears to be the intent of when it was originally created, to preserve Vermont's agricultural and forestry resources. It provides property tax savings for property owners, but since I'm going to talk to you about the Ed Fund, you can think of those as property tax education expenditures, because if you are saving money as a property taxpayer, that therefore means that there is less tax going to the education fund. So that is a expense. So again, that's how I'm going to frame it today, since my focus is education funding. And you see that on that third bullet there. And I'll also briefly touch on the hold harmless payments. That is a type of support that goes towards municipalities, and also the land use change tax, which is a revenue that goes into municipalities as well as the education and general fund. So we will touch on all of those today. So just a quick high level overview. So current use, officially known as the Use Value Appraisal Program, established in 1978. It's managed by Department of Taxes, PBR, but also Department of Forestry, Parks and Recreations. They are involved as well. And also local assessing officials at the municipal level will help out with this program. So the statutory purpose of Vermont Use Value Appraisal Program, Chapter 124, is to preserve the working landscape, preserve rural character of Vermont, and protect natural ecological systems. And you can see some of the stated purposes here are to encourage and assist the maintenance of Vermont's productive agricultural and forest land, encourage and assist in their conservation and preservation for future productive use, and for the protection of natural ecosystems. Would you like me to read all of the bullets or? Okay,
Do you want to read over those?
It's up to you. No, so when this originally began, 1978, 79, about 120,000 enrolled acres, and we now in 2024 have 2.57. So pretty significant growth there, and I have that up here on the slide. And something kind of interesting to point out there is so we have the acres enrolled. And we have from 1980 through 2024. And something kind of interesting is the gap between agriculture and forest acres was much, much closer at inception versus now. You can see that the forestry acres has really taken off. So that's just something I find pretty interesting. That
What's also interesting is that we made what felt like a significant policy change a couple years ago, and the curve didn't seem to impact the curve, but maybe.
yes, and I believe you're referring to the expand of the reserve forest land is. Yes. Yes, so I have a little bit of that in here. I would also just point out, and I'd expected someone to point this out, but no one has, so I guess I'll just say it anyway. So from about 91 through 95, where you see it kind of dipping down a little bit, it was actually an underfunded program. And from what I understand, that meant that if you enrolled in current use and the state did not have enough dollars to fulfill its end of the current use tax discount, you had to make up the difference. And because of that lack of funding, people were able to withdraw without penalty from this program until an overhaul in, I believe, 1996 changed and helped fund it. So you'll see that how it's declining, and then it comes back up right at that 96. So that would be why, if anyone was interested.
That's when we created a statewide ed fund.
Yeah, Brigham took place right around that time as well. So yes, a lot of changes happening at the same time. All right, so within current use, you have agricultural land and forest land. So agricultural land, two different parts there. You have the land itself, the farm buildings are the two parts for the agricultural piece. So agricultural land is defined here as any land exclusive of any house site in active use to grow hay or cultivated crops, pasture livestock, cultivate trees bearing edible fruit or produce, an annual maple crop, and is 25 acres or more in size. So, for agricultural purposes, defined as owned by a farmer. And in this context, this is a defined term. And I think that's intended. So, not someone who has just one cherry tree can say, well, I'm a farmer, so I think my land qualifies. It also, the land needs to be used by a farmer as part of a written lease if they are leasing the land. And also $2,000 in income for parcels of less than 25 acres. So it does need to have some production involved there. And so, like I mentioned, farmer here is a defined term. And for the context of current use, so they earn at least 1/2 of their annual gross income from the business of farming, produces farm crops that are processed in a farm facility situated on land enrolled by them in the use value appraisal program or on a house site adjoining the enrolled land, whose gross income from the sale of the processed farm products when added to other gross income from the business of farming equals at least 1/2 of the farmer's gross annual income. So essentially, as I mentioned earlier, what this is saying is you need to be a bit of a working farmer, not just you have one or two plans and you say, well, I'm a farmer now. So I think that's just a little bit of a safeguard to keep the program doing what I think it was originally intended to do based on the statutory reading beginning.
All of those things have to be true, or just one of them?
So I believe it is a or. So this or that, I would defer to tax to give you a specific, but I believe when I read the statute, it was or.
Thanks.
Yes. And so we also have forest lands and current use, and we have Act 146, which I believe is what Chair Kornheiser was speaking to about a revision there. And so So basically, what Act 146 did is introduce a second category of forest lands. Originally, it was only managed forest lands, which you see here is defined as any land exclusive of any house site that is at least 25 acres in size, and that is under active long-term forest management. And the key word here is for the purpose of growing and harvesting repeated forest crops. So that could be something, maybe in line with, your lumber, Christmas tree farm, something like that. Reserve forest land, you see the key word here is land that's managed for the purpose of attaining old forest values. So that could be just if you have land maybe for some hiking trails, recreation, stuff like that, not that it's your purpose to chop down these trees after you've grown them. So that is the key difference here between the reserve and the managed forest lands as you see defined here. And I would like to go back because in kind of my excitement to go over current use, I skipped completely over the farm buildings. So just want to go over the farm buildings here. So it needs to be on the land of a farm or agricultural land. So you have to meet those definitions first before you can say, well, this is a farm building. So just want to touch upon that and know that that is linked in with that definition. So again, you can't say, well, I have this one cherry tree. My house is therefore a farm. So just touch upon that. So how is your property enrolled in current use? How is it taxed in current use? So it is totally optional. It is up to the property owner to go and enroll. No one is going to force you to enroll your property. It's optional, requires placing a lien on that enrolled property. And every year, the current use advisory board will set the values per acre, and there are different values depending on the type of land here. So for tax year 2024, I have put up here the current values for the PVR report. So 188 per acre for forest land, and that is reserve or managed. So it's actually the same amount, even though those are two different goals maybe. And if forest land is a certain distance away from a road, you see it has a different value compared to.
Do you know how the board sets those rate? Are they trying to hit a certain
That's a great
or?
That's a great question. I do not know, but I can check. I can ask if you would
I
like.
think PBR can answer that when they come in.
Okay, yeah, that would be a good question for them perhaps. But agricultural land set at 483 per acre, and then farm buildings 0%. So there is no tax on farm buildings associated with this. And so how is the current use calculated? How is your tax bill actually going to be calculated here? So I have the equation up here as your enrolled acreage times your use value per acre, and those were the values here. I'll go back a slide. So this 188, that 141, 43, that's what we're talking about, the use value per acre times your town CLA equals your total use value. And I have an example here that we'll take a look at to kind of put some numbers to the words here. So the property owner pays their property taxes based on the use value of their property, not what the assessed value would be. And that, especially if you have that managed reserve forest land, if the goal is to keep that forest land and not sell it off, you want to use it for recreation or something, this gives you a chance to pay lower taxes because you're not generating any income potentially from this land. The land use reduction is then, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead here. So the difference between assessed property value and use value of the enrolled land, and use value here is that total use value, is known as the land use reduction. The land use reduction is subtracted from the assessed property value of the enrolled land, and the remainder is the taxable value of the property. This reduces both your municipal, if you are the property owner, municipal and non-homestead property tax. So I've thrown a lot of words at you. Let's try and make it a little more palatable here. Try to get my control panel out of the way so we can actually follow along together. So, okay, so you see here far left your acreage. the type of property next to it, use value per acre, which are those values we took a look at earlier. So you would take, we'll just start with the forest land here. So you would take those 50 acres times that 188 use value per acre, which, as I mentioned, was determined by this advisory board annually, times the CLA of this example, it's 92.08, just a random number. I don't have that linked to a specific town or municipality. And so that would give you a value of 8,655.52. You would repeat for the next two types of property. And so what you have here is that the total enrolled value of this plot of land was 219,000. The actual use value is rounded to 22,000, and your total land use reduction would be 197,000. So the land use reduction is just kind of interesting as part of the formula, but the reality is that use value of 22,000 is what you will be paying your taxes on if you own this particular piece of property. So am I with, does everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I have that here. So again, we're going to try and make this a little bit more real world. So a tax bill with and without current use. So if you own this piece of land that I just talked about, on the left here, your assessed total plot, $219,000. That land use reduction that we went over on the prior side of 197,000 would leave you with a total taxable value of $22,000 rounded. So you then use the grand list value of times 0.01 for a grand list value for tax calculation of $220. This municipal tax rate, I went alphabetically. I think this was Addison's rate for 2024, but that was just the first one that came up. No shame for Addison. And then the non-homestead property tax rate of 1.791, which was from this most recent December 1 letter. And total property tax of this individual who enrolled in current use would be $528.57. And then you can see on the right there, this individual, if they chose not to enroll, they would be paying the full amount on both of those tax types on their 219,000 assessed piece of land, which would be 5,200 and change tax rate. So you can see in the middle there at the bottom, their tax reduction from enrolling was $4,733. So that is how the benefit of enrolling your land shows up for these property owners on their tax bill.
Chair, if I can, I just want to interject here that in particular in my area, there's a lot of farmers and landowners that don't put their land under current use. So you can imagine the amount of money extra that they're paying. And, I've had over the years, so many folks say, oh, well, there's an option for them. Well, they chose not to do that option for whatever reasons. Again, there is a lien. They may have better ideas as to what they want to do with their land, whether it's logging aspect or whatever. But again, I just think it's important to know that there's a lot of my folks up my way that do not have their land in current use, and it's an extreme amount of property taxes that they're paying.
And when Jill comes from property valuation and review, she'll talk through some of that, folks who don't want to enroll, folks who get bumped off because they don't realize paperwork needs to happen every year. I think there's a really interesting argument to be made that I'm not sure I'm making. I just think it's an interesting argument that it's not actually really a tax reduction. It's actually valuing the property appropriately. And so whether or not this counts as a tax expenditure is, I think, an interesting one that might get a little too far into tax philosophy for us, but I think it's an interesting piece of this conversation. The administration's talked about a land value tax for a while, which is almost sort of the opposite end of that. But I think it's all like part of what we need to be digging into. So I appreciate you flagging that. Representative Feltus, did you have your?
No.
Oh, was it you, Representative? Someone, there was something happening.
But
Okay.
Oh, I think it's interesting to say land value tax, because I think there's some evidence that perhaps also our education tax is starting to function more like a land value tax. But I think it might have surprising impacts in some of the towns that currently benefit quite a bit from current use. I don't think it would support conservation.
No, but I was thinking about Act 250. I was thinking, okay, so if we have this current use, which is trying to keep lands open, and then we have the TIFs, which is trying to concentrate development in the town and downtown centers, then really those two things together are trying to accomplish goals of Act 250.
All right. So we'll just do a high-level fiscal overview. So what we went over was the tax savings for the individual property owner. As I mentioned at the beginning of the PowerPoint, a property owner's tax savings translate into an education tax fund expense. So here I have information from the 2024 PVR report, well, excuse me, published 2025 report, but through tax year 2024. And so you see here the municipal taxes and non-homestead property taxes foregone. And you'll notice under municipal municipal taxes is labeled as general fund. That's because of that hold harmless payment I mentioned at the beginning. That is basically if you are a municipality and property in the municipality has benefited from this and reduced your taxes, the general fund will be used to make you whole. That is what the hold harmless payment does. And so that's why foregone municipal taxes, those tax savings become a general fund expense. Same thing with your non-homestead, but with the education fund. So you'll see tax year 2024, the total was 76.192 million between the two. Again, tax savings on one hand, but for education general funds, those are actually really negative revenues there. And so again, I focus on education funds. So the impact of that is reducing the non-homestead taxes, reduce the revenue. And so that 55.7 million for 2024, that was equal to 7.02% of the non-homestead property taxes of fiscal year 2024. 792.3 million was the total non-property for fiscal year 2024.
And so just to like give a sense of scale, and I'm not asking you to do math in the future. If we put together the TIF money, however we estimate it, and the possible tax expenditure of current use, we're still not adding up to the increase in ed spending just year over year between the 2 years of 2023 and 2024. Just like for a sense of scale for all of this, because I think it's, for me, that's hard to get my head around sometimes. Yeah, Representative Feltes.
Do we know why in 1978 it was determined not to make up that value for the education fund? I mean, we did the hold harmless for the municipal side. Why was there not but we had a totally different education fund at that point too? Is that why? Does anybody know the history of why it was decided not to make up that difference?
Can you repeat that? It's a good question.
Well,
How would we do it without an education fund? I mean, is this
Well, it would just-
possible because of the anthem?
Well, I presume you would just pull more out of the general fund. You know, if you were gonna make the municipality whole for someone leaving the land as managed forest land, as an example, and you would have to make up that full amount, whether it was a separate education account at that time, I don't know if it was, or if it was just municipal or state money.
So that's a great question, Representative. I don't know the answer, but the only nugget that I would offer is the difference between those is just that the general fund or the state big entity making municipalities, small entities whole versus the ed fund and the general fund are both big state. So, it's the same. That is one difference there, is that it's the state versus smaller local municipalities. That's the only difference that I see. But it is a good question that I do not know the answer to. That's just the only distinction I see here.
To that point is, in 1978, I wasn't paying real estate taxes, so I'm just trying, was there the municipal tax and also an education tax, a local school tax on the tax bill? Were they two different lines?
Yes.
Anyone? They were?
In your
Okay.
town, you have an education tax.
In 1978?
Yeah,
1978.
before Act 60, you had to vote a school budget, and so
Yeah.
there was an education tax, and you had to vote your city budget, it's the municipal tax.
So you're making up the difference for the local school district through probably the general fund then. Yeah. Got it. Thanks.
Let's have we can ask for some legislative research too.
It was an municipality. When I look at the growth of the use of the current use from in your charts,
Hmm.
and I wonder how that compares to the growth of the use of TIFs. Is one far ahead in its use than the other?
That's another great question that Ted and I did not sit down about, but we can certainly take a look and kind of overlay TIF and current use growth.
I mean, if they're both from theory, that they're both trying to accomplish the goals of compact development, don't ruin farmland with development, and keep the forest intact, and have working lands, be healthy.
Interesting question. Yeah, we'll take a look. Any other questions? Okay, so just again, I kind of jumped ahead when I spoiled it for you all, but the hold harmless payment there is the tax revenue foregone by a municipality due to current use is covered by hold harmless payment that is paid by the general fund. And it's equal to 100% of non-homestead municipal property tax reduction due to current use for fiscal year 2025, which is not the same as what I had on that other one. We have a new report that came out separate because this is paid November 1st, I believe, the tax department said for fiscal year 25. And so that was I guess will be 19.77 million. And so the final financial piece of current use that I have here for you is the land use change tax. So the municipal, the education, and then the land use change tax. So once land is enrolled in current use, once it has that lien on it, it's enrolled in the land use change tax. If you want to develop your property, you've decided you're done with farming, you want to build an apartment complex or something like that, you would then have to pay your land use change tax. And develop is defined. There are many bullets on develop in the statute. So this is just one of them. Construction of any building, road, or other structure, or any mining, excavation, or landfill activity. Or if you are just want to remove for whatever reason, maybe you don't want to develop, but you just want to remove yourself from the program. So that's 10% of fair market value of your enrolled property. And then half of that, when it is time to pay the bill, half of that, up to 2,000 per acre, goes to the municipality to kind of end that relationship there. And then the remainder goes to the general fund and the education fund after the municipality has had their share, and that is a 75 to 25% split. So just big round numbers, if there was large plot of land, $1 million, you would have half of that, the 500,000, moving on to the municipality, unless of course that 2,000 per acre would depend on the piece of land, but anyways.
Just a clarification on that assessment as 10% of fair market value. My understanding, unless it's changed, is that's 10% of fair market value of what you're removing from the program. In other words, it's not based on your adjusted for the total acreage. It's, you take out 10 acres, fair market value of that 10 acres is at 10%, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, thank you. That's a very important distinction. Yes, it's only the part that was covered. This is to remove that lien from it. If it was not part of this, it should not be involved in your lot.
Thanks.
And it's the current fair market value of that 10 acres, because before it was based on its current use value. And then made a change in the law to
Right.
make the actual new current fair market value if you were to pull it out.
All right, so I just have here from the PBR report published, that 2025 report. They have much more information on their table. I narrowed it down to make it a little easier for everyone to digest here, but you can just get an idea on how much is assessed, how much goes to the municipality, and then from the statute, what remains from after taking out that municipal's portion would be the part that is split up, the 75-25%.
Did something happen in 2020? I mean, the pandemic, I guess.
Yeah, people
Sorry.
moved here.
Yeah, okay, cool. It's wild.
Okay, so just some policy intersections with current use. So current use intersects with Act 59, Community Resilience and Biodiversity Act, by making it easier for private landowners to afford the property taxes on their forested lands. Act 59 sets a goal of 30% of Vermont land conserved by 2030, 50% conserved by 2050. And then also tourism in Vermont is, as I'm sure we're all aware, motivated by the scenic natural resources and working landscape, and outdoor recreation trails are often on privately held parcels. And again, that I think plays into that reserve forest land that was added in 2022. So you can reserve that forest land for trails without having to chop it down for the previous, which was the manage. And just want to add in here the report that came out, I believe it was earlier this year, that $2.1 billion is added to the state's GDP through outdoor recreation. So, there's certainly that aspect when you're thinking about current use and the cost. So just interesting intersection.
So I'd like to ask a question on the current use where you say it intersects with Act 59. How does it intersect with Act 59?
So it intersects
Because it's not counted. It's not counted in the land calculations to achieve the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, right?
No, it's not.
It's not.
I'll have to double check.
Guess the reason I'm saying that is, spoiler alert, I have a bill to be able to include current use land, even though it's not conserved in perpetuity forever. My feeling is it should be counted in the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. So anyway, I don't know what intersection you're talking about there with 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 when it's not included.
Do you want to jump in?
Temporary Night Fiscal Office, there may be potentially, if a private landowner has put their land under a conservation easement, and if they're then enrolled in current use, would be able to make it easier for them to afford. And then it's something I'm thinking about, and that when you look at a map of conserved land, the land that's under a conservation easement through private landowners is kind of counted in that mapping, but one potential thought there. Yep.
Yeah, with regards to the suggestion you just made, Representative Higley, about your bill. If it's in current use currently, I'm just kind of parsing this. It could be considered parts of 30 by 30 or whatever, but if it can be removed, then it comes out of the 30 by 30. I mean, so these are temporary. I don't know, it's temporary provision, temporary mathematics.
We're gonna look more into it. Thanks for raising it, Representative Higley.
Yeah, so that's my final informational slide. I have the resources here, and if you are interested in taking a look at where I got some of the information from, there's some interesting pamphlets and charts out there. So yeah, that is all I have prepared. So
And the only other thing too is, and I don't know, do you have an estimated cost for forestry plan? Because people, landowners that enroll their land in current use have to have a forestry plan. And that's a cost as well to the landowners. And of course, it all depends on how big your parcel is, but there is a cost to that.
I did not-
I'll flag that for Jill so she can come prepared with that when she comes from PBR. It's a great question. I think there was someone before you, but I lost whoever it was. Okay, go for it.
I wanted to understand more about the lien and how much is, a lien is put on, and is there growth of property value considered when that property is sold? Or how does it?
So I'm not an expert on liens. I can't tell you the specifics on how the lien works, just that if you withdraw and you pay the LUCT, the lien is removed from that property. But
How much is?
so that's the 10% of the fair market assessed value, the assessed value of the property withdrawn.
Not the fair market value. Yeah. That's the fair.
10% of it.
Is that, do you have examples of how that math works out? Like if somebody say $200 each year, or the one that you had in there, was it 4,000 or 5,000 each year? That much each year compared to what the 10% is of the fair market value they sell and
Okay, so I would have to get back to you on that because I would need to, it depends on the piece of property that you're selling. So are you talking, and also how long you held it and
I know what you're talking about, Carol.
Well-
If you save, let's say, $10,000 in your property tax, there's nothing to do with the penalty.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, though, I'm actually thinking about this education fund stuff
Yeah.
and thinking, well, if there's $10,000 saved, and then
It's a good
does the
thought.
ed fund get the growth of what that 10,000 is when that property is sold?
It's a good thought.
There's an interesting proposal floating around that I don't know if it's gonna come in as a bill or not. It's just, that's sort of an idea that people have floated, that the property tax credit should be sort of like held, and when the property is, as if it was a lien, and then when the property is sold, it would go to the end fund, which is separate from current use, but it's sort of a similar construct to what you're imagining.
I was just gonna go back, the example that he gave us on page 12. If you had a property that's assessed at $219,000 and then in 1 year you had it in current use. And so you only ended up paying taxes on 22,000. If it were not in current use and next year you decide to pull it all out, you're gonna be paying on 219,000 as opposed to 22. And that money some would go to the education. But that's the difference. You're paying on a much larger, you're paying on its full market value when you take it out, plus the 10% penalty.
Anyone have any more questions for Ezra?
It's not a question, just a comment.
Okay, then I just want to let Ezra leave the chair if everyone's done with questions for him. Okay, thank you very much. Representative Brannigan, jump on in.
Comment is,
Yeah.
I've been told many times by folks up in Franklin County that without the current use program, there would be no farming in Vermont because they can't afford to keep the property. So without this tax reduction, this is pretty significant to the way we live here. So we need to be very careful about any changes we consider.
Agreed. I mean, and there's sort of the counterfactual of maybe if this wasn't here, property taxes, there would have been more pressure to keep property taxes low. I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
But certainly if it went away tomorrow, that would be no good for lots of people. Yeah.
It's also too thinking about the conservation goals, balancing growing the tax base and allowing more people to participate in paying taxes versus keeping more land conserved.
Okay, we are done for the day. We are back here tomorrow morning at 9. Where we're gonna dive into the same sort of body of work, but with Kirby Keaton from Legislative Council. Please keep reading all the reports.